A little bit about this webinar. It was developed through funding from the North Carolina Division of Social Services by the Family and Children's Resource Program, which is part of the Jordan Institute for Families at the UNC Chapel Hill School of Social Work, which is a mouthful to say. A recording of this webinar will be available on ncswlearn.org as well as on the FCRP website. Thank you for joining us. I want to touch a little bit of information on the goals for this webinar. So by the end of our time together today, we hope that you'll be able to understand the ICPC articles and regulations, be knowledgeable in sending and receiving those ICPC requests, as well as be familiar with resources related to ICPC requests, and then lastly, be informed of new electronic processing systems such as NCFAST and the National Electronic Interstate Compact Enterprise, which you'll hear us refer to as NEIS. In addition to the chat pod that many of you have already found, you'll see that there is also a way to communicate to everyone in the room, as well as you can click and send a message to just the hosts, meaning all of us here at UNC. And this will be the primary way that you can communicate with us throughout our time together. So using this chat box, you can send in questions that you may have, and we have a time allotted for answering questions throughout our presentation. Or comments that you have can also be added in this box. And I know a lot of you so far are using it to introduce yourselves and tell us what county that you are here from. We will say that this box moves kind of fast because we have so many people here in our webinar, but we do have someone who's going to help us keep track of your questions. So if you can't see it in the chat pod, we have it so that we can answer it when it comes time for questions. A little bit more information about questions. Since this is just one 90-minute webinar and we have about 200 people registered, we may not be able to get to all the questions that you may have, but we do want to get you those answers. So for the questions that we do not get to today during our time together, we will capture all of those questions, and we will be sending out a follow-up document to everyone registered to this webinar that will have all the questions that were asked as well as answers to those questions so that you can refer to them. One other piece of information for being able to use icons to get our attention, in the top of your screen there's a drop-down box that looks like a little person with their hand raised, and if you click on the drop-down box you can see other icons. One being raise hand or speaking louder or softer, applause, laughter. Those are options that you can use. So I would like to go ahead and try using this drop-down box. So anyone who is there participating in a group, if you could click on the raise hand icon, it helps us know how many people out there actually have groups there. I'll give everyone a few seconds to find that icon. All right. Looks like we have quite a few people participating in a group, so everyone welcome. Thanks for letting us know. Also, just a little bit of information about some of the different roles we have here together within child welfare that we have represented. We pulled together from registration information. So we have about 50 line supervisors, 106 direct client contact, as well as a group of directors and program managers. We also have some staff development and trainers, and then also other various roles within child welfare that are all here for this information today. So welcome everyone. Thank you all for being here. Again, my name is Crystal Coble and I'll be your moderator. We have technical support here on site from Philip Armfield, and John McMahon is also on the line to help us out. And now I will let our guests, Rebekah and Althea introduce themselves and tell you a little about them.
Good morning. My name is Rebekah Richmond, and I'm from the Division of Social Services. I've been a member of the Interstate Compact team for about 5.5 years, and prior to that have had county experience in a number of different roles. But I'm happy to be here today to present this information to you all.
Good morning. My name is Althea Swinson, and I'm also a Human Services Program Consultant assigned to the ICPC team. And I joined the ICPC team in 2017, and I have over 15 years of child welfare experiences. And I want to thank you for taking this time to join us today, and I'm really excited that you all are here and ready to learn all about ICPC.
All right, and not only thank you to you all for being here, but thank you to our presenters for being here to help with this learning opportunity for our child welfare system. We'll make sure that you have their contact information at the end of the webinar as well. So we are ready to get started, and so we'll start with Althea asking you all a question.
All right, so good morning. We have a quick poll question that we would like to get started with. And if you see on your screen, there's a poll question there that talks about how confident you are with the ICPC process. If you could, please click the response that's most relevant to you. Alrighty, it looks like we have about over half, maybe about 44% of our participants feel somewhat confident with the ICPC process, and that's pretty good. So we hope that by the end of this webinar that you'll be feeling more confident with the ICPC process. So what is ICPC? So sometimes the best family for a child does not always live in our state. So then we look at the Interstate Compact. So the Interstate Compact on placement of children established those procedures for assuring the safety and stability of placements for children across state lines. You will hear me often refer to ICPC as a compact. And ICPC, it is our uniform law. It is a legal binding agreement that has been implemented by all 50 states, including the District of Columbia and the U.S. Virgin Islands. The compact kind of established an orderly procedure for processing referrals, implementation of placements, and responsibilities of sending agencies. The compact is certain that both the sending and the receiving states have the pertinent information prior to a child being placed. At the compact, each state has a deputy compact administrator, or DCA, which we often refer to, and that person is appointed to manage the overall administration of the compact. So why ICPC? So these are some federal mandates that outlines the administrative framework for ICPC. They are provided here for your reference for you to kind of go back and review on your own. But these are very important to understand because these mandates ensure that we process cases within a safe and timely manner and make certain that our children are being kept in a safe placement. It also ensures that their needs are being met. One of the laws that we want to look at is the Public Law 115-123, the Family First Prevention Services Act of 2018. And that mandates a requirement for states to have a centralized interstate processing system. And later in the webinar, you'll hear more about NEAS and the interface with NC-FAST, and that is the electronic processing system that is currently being utilized in ICPC. Now we want to look closely at Public Law 109-239. And this is a federal mandate that provides the guidelines for conducting timely home studies. So it establishes a specific compliance time frame by which the receiving state must provide a home study. And this federal law states that a home study must be provided within 60 calendar days of a receiving request. So this requirement also applies to our foster, relative, and adoption home studies. The 60-day time frame does require an exemption for home studies that require training or education, primarily as you see with our foster care requests. One of the things to remember about the 60 days is that the 60-day time frame runs when the home study request is received by the receiving state ICPC office, not the local agency when that completion will be when it will be due. So each state may establish its own rules for what constitutes a completed home study, and the 60 days is the federal law time frame. So it's very important that you remember the 60 calendar days. Whenever you have a time frame that exceeds the 60 days, you are required to send what we call a status report, and it outlines the burials and provides an anticipated time for completing that home study. So the importance of ICPC. So the importance of ICPC kind of provides a home assessment that determines that the placement is safe and in the best interest of the child. Here you see that it ensures that an appropriate financial and medical plan is in place to meet the needs of the child prior to the placement. And also, when a child is placed, the ascending agency provides supervision and reports on the child's progress. So trying to see when ICP applies to your cases. So ICPC applies to cases where children are in temporary custody of a DSS agency or under court jurisdiction. Anytime there's a placement into a foster care, including foster homes, group homes, and residential treatment facilities that are placed in another state. Placement when the parents and relatives that are made by a DSS agency, and placements into prospective adopted homes. So when ICPC does not apply, so these are the placements made in other states that are not governed by the compact. Placements that are made in medical, hospital, and educational facilities. Placement of a child that is not in the custody of DSS and can be made by a parent or their legal guardian. The compact doesn't apply to divorce or custody procedures. Children that are placed outside the country. And visits with families that are less than 30 days. Those are placements that does not apply to the ICPC compact. So it's very important to understand the definition of relative as it is defined in the compact. So the definition of relative as defined in the compact is a birth or an adopted brother, sister, step-parent, a step-brother, a step-sister, uncle, aunt, first cousin, niece, nephew, or any relatives of a half-blood or marriage that is denoted by prefixes of grand and great. So it's very important to understand the definition of a relative as defined by the compact, because when you're sending a request, you have to understand that if it doesn't meet the criteria of relative, then you cannot send it as a relative request. You do have the option to send a request as a foster care study if it doesn't meet the definition of a relative requirement. So in addition to sending requests for children that are in DSS custody, we also process cases where children are in court jurisdiction or court-involved cases. And the court jurisdiction cases is when the court has taken custody and it's been awarded to a third cousin, and then, to a third party. And then for our court involvement cases, those are cases that the court is still involved, but the legal custody may still remain with the parent. So we also process those cases as well within the ICPC compact.
So we do want to take a moment and see if there are any initial questions so far on some of that foundational information that we've covered around what is ICPC and when it applies and when it does not apply. So I'll give you just a few moments to type in any questions you may have at this time. So it looks like we have a few questions that have started to roll in, so we'll take a few of them. The first one that I'll ask is, if we do not get a report within 60 calendar days, does the sending agency need to submit a request for an update? So Althea, I'll let you answer that question, or Rebekah.
Okay, this is Rebekah. I'll answer that. So if 60 days approaches and you do not have a home study, you can send us a request on your agency letterhead for an update. We will also be monitoring that case in our system and be following up as that date approaches as well.
All right, thank you. So I'll go ahead and pull out this other next question that I have. I'm trying to keep track of as it's moving. When a state allows a foster home to move out of state with the foster child and they want us to do a home study, does ICPC apply?
Yes, we are actually going to cover that in the next section.
And I have one other question about who would qualify as a relative. So will a second cousin fall under the relative category per the definition?
Hi, this is Althea. So a second cousin does not meet the definition of relative under the ICPC. You do have the option to send a second cousin as a foster care request.
All right, so I see that there's still questions coming in, and we'll have another opportunity for questions, but I want to make sure we got some of those answered that were really about some of that initial information we've covered and some of who does qualify and falls under that definition of relative. So as you have more questions, feel free to ask them. We will answer as many as possible. So we will go ahead and move on to our next portion of information, and Rebekah is going to share with us a little bit about overview of articles and regulations.
Good morning. Let's talk about articles and regulations. So the difference between the two is that articles are law. Those are found in our General Statute 7B 3800, and they allow for uniformity across all 50 states and the 2 territories. So articles are law, regulations are policy. There are 10 articles and 12 regulations, and we're really just going to talk about those that are most commonly used here. Regulation 1 refers to the relocation of a family unit, and this is we had this question just a few minutes ago about a foster family relocating. So this is to ensure that an already safe and stable placement made in the sending state can continue if the child relocates with the resource in the receiving state. It's applicable to placements in the excess of 90 days. The intent of this regulation is really to allow the supervision to be uninterrupted. So while the request is for a home study or a license, it would also include supervision. The referral must include a copy of the current approved home study and or a license, as well as progress and placement reports for the past 6 months. Regulation 2. This is really the bulk of our work. Regulation 2 is most commonly used by those in the listening audience today and is for our public cases. It applies to cases involving children who are under the jurisdiction of a court for abuse, neglect, or dependency as a result of action taken by a child welfare agency. The purpose is to obtain a home study and placement decision for foster care, public adoptions, and or with relatives or parents. Again, Regulation 2 has a 60-day time frame, and that's per our Federal Law 109-239, which is Safe and Timely Act. If a study requires additional time for completion, the receiving state will send a status report and really explain what are the barriers and delays for this home study being completed within those time frames. If it is a request for a foster care license, a preliminary study should be sent to our office within the 60-day time frame. Educational and training requirements for licensing often exceed that 60-day time frame. We ask that your office update us on the status of that license about every 30 days. We too will follow up with you using our transmittal to check on the status. Regulation 3 refers to definitions and placement categories. There are a number of terms in Regulation 3 that we use. Most commonly, we talk about concurrence, which we're going to discuss in a later slide. We talk about placement resources there. That's really the subject of the home study. Relative is listed there, and we've mentioned that in a previous slide. Also is sending state and receiving state. So those are terms that we use quite often in our office and in our communication with your agency. The next slide is about Regulation 4, and this is for residential requests. So we refer to them as PRTF, which is Psychiatric Residential Treatment Facilities. Regulation 4 provides for the safety and protection of children placed in a PRTF in another state. Approval should be received prior to placement, and this can apply to children up to the age of 21. It's important to mention that a very important step of this process is if a child has been adjudicated delinquent and DJJ is involved. 7B 3800, Article 6, is titled Institutional Care of Delinquent Children. It states that no such placement shall be made unless the child is given a court hearing on notice to the parent or guardian with the opportunity to be heard prior to being sent to another state for institutional care. So we are looking for a court order, and DJJ is really good about helping to obtain this order, but the order should very clearly state that equivalent facilities for the child are not available in the sending agency's jurisdiction, and that institutional care in another jurisdiction is in the best interest of the child and will not produce a hardship to the child and or his family. So, and again, that is for children who have been adjudicated delinquent. So that's not required for all residential requests, but just those children that have been adjudicated delinquent. Regulation 4 also covers emergency placements for residential care. We understand there are times when a child's placement in the PRTF becomes an emergency, and we try to accommodate those requests as best as we can. The decisions may be made within 1 business day as long as the referral that you send to our office is complete. When you're sending the emergency request, a few items to note is that clinical staff must make that recommendation for an emergency placement. So not all PRTFs will be emergencies, but we ask that you mark your request as urgent when you send it to our office. You can also call or email our office to indicate that the request is coming or has been sent. Let's talk about Regulation 7. You often refer to these as the expedited or priority request. These fall under Regulation 7 of the Compact. Again, this is to expedite an ICPC decision for the placement of a child with a parent, a step-parent, a grandparent, an adult uncle or aunt, an adult brother or sister, or the child's guardian. Any other relative that is not listed here will not meet the criteria for expediting the request. Regulation 7 does not apply to children who are already placed in violation of the compact, and it does not apply when the request is for foster care or adoption. If you happen to send us a request and it doesn't meet one of these relative criteria, we will then contact you and discuss sending it for a Regulation 2, which would be our processing of 60 days. That's for a public relative or foster care request. So criteria for Regulation 7, unexpected dependency due to a sudden or recent incarceration, incapacitation or death of a parent or guardian. The child or children, there's a child that's 4 or younger. There's a sibling group with a substantial relationship to the proposed placement resource, or the child or children is an emergency placement. So you can expect the decision to be turned around in about 20 business days. If that time frame will be exceeded, the receiving state is pretty good about sending a status report to let us know why it's going to require a little bit more time. There are very specific forms to use when you're expediting a request, and that is our DSS Form 1839, which is the Order of Compliance. This is the preferred state form and court order to use when you're expediting a request. But if your court is using something different, just be sure that all of that language is included in that order. When you're mailing the request, be sure that you're following those instructions on the checklist and sorting your packet accordingly. So the ICPC Form 101 should be on top of the packet, and this really helps us to quickly identify which requests are expedited. Let's look at the time frames under Regulation 7. So the judge is signing the order and providing it to DSS hopefully within 2 business days, because in 3 business days you're going to send that to our office. We're really looking for that order to arrive in our office within 5 days of the judge's signature, because we want to quickly turn that information around to the receiving state so that they can begin processing the request. If your referral arrives in our office and it's beyond those time frames, we will then process it under Regulation 2. Some counties will also choose to use priority mailing to our office to meet the time frames. Article 5 is this slide about residential care when you're sending a PRTF request in. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at a different slide. I'm sorry. Article 5 is about the retention of jurisdiction. The sending agency shall retain jurisdiction over the child and have financial responsibility of the child during the placement period. Most states prefer a minimum of 6 months supervision period. Concurrence, I mentioned this in a previous slide. Concurrence to discharge is when the receiving state gives the sending state or agency written permission to terminate supervision and relinquish jurisdiction to the resource. When you receive concurrence or when you give concurrence, this is the green light to make a decision about closing your case. You're transferring custody or guardianship and then closing your case. And that means placement has gone well for all, especially the child. Let's talk about supervision here. Supervision must begin when the child is placed in an approved, or supervision will begin when a child is placed in an approved placement and the 100B is received. Sometimes you hear about placement occurring, and if you hear about that by some other way, you should begin supervision as well. But definitely contact our office so that we can secure that 100B formally. Supervision must include face-to-face visits with the child at least once a month. And there are written supervision reports at least once every 90 days following the date that you receive the 100B. We do provide a couple forms for supervision, and that is the DSS 5331. That's the 30-day report, and the DSS 5332. That DSS 5332 has a place that you can make recommendations about concurrence. When you're doing your supervision, you should be sure to include any available report cards, or if there's any evaluations or other reports that have been done during that period. Those are helpful to send to the sending agency as well. If applicable, the supervising caseworker's recommendation regarding continuation of placement, return of legal custody to the resource or parent, finalization of an adoption, or granting legal guardianship to the resource. That is the information found in the DSS 5332, that 90-day report that I talked about, that specific, we're looking for those recommendations. The receiving state shall respond to any report of abuse or neglect of a child placed in during the supervision period. And the sending state is who is responsible for case planning and ongoing safety and well-being for any child placed in the receiving state. Supervision can and should begin prior to the receipt of the 100B if the receiving state has been informed by any other means that the child has been placed in an approved placement. And supervision should continue and must continue until one of the following occurs. A child reaches the age of majority or legal emancipation. A child is adopted, or custody or guardianship is transferred to the resource. The child is no longer resides at the home approved for placement. Jurisdiction over the child is terminated by the sending state. The sending state requests in writing that supervision be discontinued, and the receiving state concurs. This slide will help you determine the difference between a placement and a visit. When you're trying to make that determination, consider the purpose, the duration, and the intent. And that will often help you decide, is this a visit or is it a placement? Visits have a very clear start and stop date. If visits are happening, we ask that you give us a courtesy so that we can let another state know that a child will be in their state for the purpose of a visit. This slide talks about the violation of the compact. In the event of a violation, it's important to remember that the sending state bears full liability and responsibility for the safety of the child. That means that the sending state or sending agency is responsible for supervising that placement until this placement is approved. The receiving state may request immediate removal of the child. The receiving state may proceed with the home study, but is not required to do so until the child is returned to the sending state, or as long as the child is placed in violation. The receiving state may choose to open for courtesy supervision, but it is not required to do so. All right. That's a lot of information.
Thank you, Rebekah. So again, at this time, we want to take an opportunity to answer some of your questions. We do have some in queue that have been asked so far, but as you think of others, I'll give you a moment to go ahead and type them in the chat pod on information that we've covered so far. So the first question that we had asked previously, and I just want to clarify that for anyone else that had this question, does ICPC apply when children are placed in out-of-state group homes or PRTFs?
Yes, you should be sending in an ICPC request when placing children out of state for the purposes of treatment in a PRTF or a group home. It's important to note, I will add, that when you're making those placements, do remember that the receiving state does not provide supervision for those children.
All right, thank you, Rebecca. Next question that I had, Randy, was if a home study has to be done with a grandparent and he or she is required to become licensed, that would be way past the 60 days required to complete the home study. So I think the question here would be, what do we do in this circumstance?
Hello, so this is Althea. If the request is for a relative home study, then it's a relative home study. If it's for a foster care study, then it will require a family to be licensed. 60-day time frame is required for the actual home study. It doesn't necessarily mean that the home has to be approved within 60 days, but that home study does need to be completed. The compact does allow exemption for foster care licensing not to exceed 180 days.
And as your questions are continuing to come in, we are tracking them. We do know that some of the information we will get to in our presentation coming up, or it may be a question that we'll have to pull information together for and get it to you in our follow-up document. So we're continuing to keep that information tracked. We won't forget your questions. And we'll have an opportunity to answer some more in a little bit as well. So we are going to continue with some more information, and Althea is going to share us a little more about the process.
All right, so let's look at the steps of the ICPC process. So here's a flow chart, the sending agency process. So the process begins when the sending agency, the child welfare social worker, sends the ICPC referral to the ICPC office. Here, the ICPC office receives the packet or the referral, which is reviewed by the consultant. Once that packet is complete and meet the requirements for both the sending and receiving state, then that state consultant sends the complete request to the receiving state ICPC office, where that request is reviewed again by that receiving state ICPC consultant. The receiving state ICPC consultant then send the request to their local agency to complete the home study. Here is where the Public Law 109-239, the federal law for safe and timely placement of children, begins when that receiving state confirms that they have a complete packet and sends it to their local agency. The local agency completes the home study and sends their response back to the receiving state ICPC office for an official approval or denial. The receiving state signs that 100A and sends that decision back to the sending state ICPC office, who will then notify you, the sending agency. So if a placement is approved, the approval is valid for 6 months from the date that that 100A is signed by that sending state's, by the receiving state's consultant. Please note that if you have an approval, that the 100B must be submitted so that placement can be notified to the other agency and supervision can begin. If your placement is denied, then the ICPC case is closed and there's no further action needed. Do know that if you do get a request that is denied, you may send a new request with documentation and evidence that the conditions of the denial has been met and you wish for that placement resource to be reconsidered as an option. If you have a approval that expires at the end of 6 months, you are required to send a new request. So the 100A form, this is the sending agency's formal written request to the receiving state of its intentions to make an interstate placement for a request for a finding to determine if the placement is in the best interest of the child. So the approval in the 100A indicates that a placement can be made. Whenever you're completing the 100A, you want to make sure that you complete it in its entirety. So this next slide kind of takes a look at the DSS 1837, which is our 100A form. So in completing this form, I want you to remember to complete the Section 1 fields pertaining to ICWA, and the 4E determination. It is Section 1 of the form. Section 2 of the form kind of talks about the type of care that's going to be requested. Remember that you can only choose one type of care per request. So you cannot choose foster and adoption when sending one request for a ICPC request. An adoption request can be sent if legal clearances have been granted. You can send multiple requests for different placement resources for the same child. Understand the 100B form. So we talked about this form before. The 100B confirms that an approved placement is made in accordance with the compact. This is where we send this form to notify the state that the child's been placed and we want supervision to begin. This form also is a withdrawal of a request prior to a home study. It also indicates if an approved resource will not be used. You can also report changes in the placement resource or changes in the type of care, changes in address, and we also use the 100B to close a case. So let's look at the checklist for ICPC. This is the North Carolina DSS 5255 form. So this checklist is a great tool to ensure that you have a complete ICPC packet. It's easy to follow and all the forms are very user-friendly to complete. We talked about the 100A and the 100B form already. And remember, when you're sending in a request for a Regulation 1, you do need to include a 100B to ensure the continuous supervision of the placement. When you're submitting your current custody order, make sure it is a signed order. What we're looking for here is that it indicates who has jurisdiction and placement responsibility for the child. You want to include a current case history of the child. You need to also complete the DSS 5251, which is the financial medical plan. When completing this form, it kind of gives you some guidance to select only one type of plan. So the financial medical form is completed per child for a request that includes siblings. So with this form, the financial responsibility will always primarily be your agency responsibility until the court has terminated jurisdiction or the case is closed, even if the placement resource is supporting the child's needs. The current case plan, you need to include your family services agreement. You also need to be completing the DSS 1840, which is the case manager statement, and it must be signed by both the social worker and the supervisor. We want you to use the case manager statement as a screening of the placement resource. It's kind of your vetting to kind of make sure that the placement resource is appropriate for the child. When sending a Regulation 7 expedited request, there is a separate case manager statement that you need to complete for Reg 7. You also need to complete the priority home study request form and provide the order of compliance, which is the DSS 5252 form. Rebekah talked about the supervision forms that you can also use when providing supervision, and that is the DSS 5331 and the 5332 forms. So it's always good to use this as your checklist when you're putting your packets together. At the bottom, there's some additional guidance that kind of tell you how to sort the packet. You want to make sure that you're sending in 3 complete identical packets when sending in your request.
Let's talk about electronic processing. This is exciting. So Public Law 115-123, which is Family First Prevention Services Act, required states to develop an electronic interstate case processing system. And that is what we refer to as NEAS, the National Electronic Interstate Compact Enterprise. Effective December 3rd, 2018, North Carolina implemented NEAS. This allows our state and office to quickly and securely exchange data and require documents across state lines. It really helps streamline the process across states and allows for quick access to state updates or case updates. The next slide will share which states are using NEAS. The states we work with the most would be Florida, Georgia, Maryland, New York, Ohio, and South Carolina. NC Fast. We also began using NC Fast December 3rd, 2018, and this offers electronic processing for ICPC. Currently, we have 11 pilot counties. Those pilot counties include Richmond, Sampson, Rowan, Rockingham, Guilford, Orange, Catawba, Franklin, Macon, Chatham, and Dare. Non-pilot counties will continue to use our manual process to send in their ICPC request. NC Fast communicates directly with NEAS. So we wanted to share our data to just show you how much work we are doing at our office. And this table shows our data for 1 month during the second quarter of state fiscal year 2018. You can see relative studies, they're about 37% of our work, followed by foster care and then parent request. So about 75% of our work is done with our county DSS agencies. We are a very busy office. Our next slide will show you who is assigned to your county. You've got the phone number and the email address, and you can print this. I believe it's in the handouts and keep it with you, and then you'll have the most up-to-date contact information for your consultant. We did want to share our Deputy Compact Administrator, and this is our supervisor, Carla McNeil, and here is the contact information for her as well, along with our web page. And our next slide will list some of the resources where you can find our policy manual for ICPC. You can find our DSS forms that we've referred to. We also shared the ICPC state pages, and that's a really helpful website if you're thinking about doing some work with the state of Florida or Virginia. You can go here to this website and find out what does this state require. As you know, some states require licensure for relatives and some don't. And so some states have different financial and medical arrangements, and this page is really helpful. We use it a lot in our office to tell us what is another state looking for when sending a request.
All right, so we are going to take a few more questions while Althea and Rebekah are looking over those questions. I do want to again point you to those handouts that you have that you downloaded at the beginning of this webinar. There were a lot of references to them, and they can be helpful, as well as the resources that are on there. And then the information that's in the slides is also included so that you have that information. So I do want to go back and answer a few more of these questions. What I will say is some of the questions have very specifics about very specific cases, and instead of answering those on the fly, those will probably be questions that we go back and actually look at the specifics so that we can get you the best answer possible. So some of the questions, it may be better for us to pull that get information together so that you really have a good answer to your question and not just what our presenters have off the top of their head at the moment. So one question that I'll want to go ahead and ask, who determines when a relative placement has to become licensed foster care? Is it based on the receiving state's request or the sending state?
So the sending state has the authority to make decisions for that child. And if they've sent us a request for relative care, then that's what we do. But if they've sent us a request for licensure, then we do need to honor that request, regardless of what our policy states about that particular relative. When you're sending a request to another state, they may have requirements about relatives needing to be licensed prior to placement. And so I would refer you to that state page, ICPC state pages, so that you can be sure what is it that the state where the resource lives, what are their requirements.
Thank you, Rebekah. And I think that information actually might be helpful with quite a few questions that we have that are specifically around, the process of licensing and is it a process that they have to go through. And so really referring to, who's the sending state, who's the receiving state, and what are the guidelines in that state can really answer a lot of these questions. And again, the follow-up document will more closely make sure that we answer that. So another question that we had that came up that might be helpful to go ahead and cover. Once the ICPC request has been denied and we're notified by DHR to close the case, whose responsibility is it to notify the placement resource that they were denied?
Hello, this is Althea. So if you are the sending state and you receive a notification that your placement was denied, you as the agency should be notifying your placement resource of that decision by the other state.
All right. Thank you. Next question. Has the state website been updated with all current forms?
Yes, that website is up to date.
All right. Good information to know. Now, what I will say is we have a handful of questions here about NICE that are related, and probably answering one of them will answer quite a few of them. So has NICE been presented to local counties as an option for processing ICPC claims? This is the first time I've heard of it.
So I will explain this. So ICPC is using NICE to communicate with other states. So it's not a platform for a county to communicate with our office. It's the communication between states. And we're using it for those 27 states that are listed on the slide that we showed. NC-FAST is the electronic processing system for counties. And as that rolls out to counties, they'll be using, or you'll be using NC-FAST to electronically submit to our state office, and we'll be using NICE. And states are coming on board at different times, so that's exciting for us.
All right, our questions are continuing to come in. Are the Regulation 7 criteria, A through D, all necessary or required, or is a single one of these sufficient?
Hello, this is Althea. So it is, if you're referring to the order of compliance in the Regulation 7, it is one of those conditions.
All right, thank you for that clarification, Althea. Does the NC ICPC office have a master list of states that specifically require licensure in all ICPC requests?
Hello. So we typically refer to the ICPC state pages website to keep an update. Some states change when they require licensure. So we ourselves have to always kind of refer back to the ICPC state page to make sure, what the latest requirement is for a state. So we don't really have a master list because it's always changing from state to state.
right, we're still tracking some of these questions that are coming in. And again, some of the ones that are very specific, we'll have to make sure we get to you in the follow-up document. We had quite a few questions again about NIES and getting access, but I believe we've gotten the answers to those to you on what that process will look like. I see one other question that I don't know we've answered. If we are the receiving state and the resource placement was denied, who notifies the placement resource?
So if North Carolina or your DSS has completed a home study and is not able to approve that resource, you should notify that resource. Then you would send us the home study, and we will send that to the sending state.
Thank you, Rebekah. And one other question came in related to NC Fast and NIES, and I want to make sure we clarify this. So if we're not an NC Fast pilot county, will the ICPC office still be using the NIES program for those 28 states that you mentioned?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so I believe for all of the questions that have come in so far, either we've answered with content or we've answered other questions that were similar, or possibly there's specifics that we will have to get back to you on with follow-up information. So what I would like for everyone to do and to think about is with this time that we've spent together, I want you to think about something that you will do to apply what you've learned today. So if you could type into the chat one thing that you will do in response to what you've learned today. So I'll give everyone a little bit of time to do that. I know some of you are in groups and may need to talk amongst yourselves to come up with what you would like to put here. All right, so while a few of you are still adding in your information on what you would like to do in response to what you've learned today, it looks like quite a few of you have pulled out some really good resources. So one that I will mention is a lot of you said you want to review the ICPC state page, and both Rebekah and Althea have emphasized that how helpful that really has been for some counties. So that is one good thing for you to be able to review. So when you have questions you can refer to. And again, as they said, it's something that can constantly change. So it may be that an answer to the question, it really is good as an good idea to go in and look up what those guidelines are. A lot of people said information about sharing within your teams, and I do just want to remind you that sharing the handouts and slides is great, and that the recording of the webinar will be on NCSW Learn as well as FCRP's website. So if there's specific information that you want to point them to there, then that can also be helpful. Also, the mention of NEAS, I think it was newer information for a lot of you to know that that may be something that's coming your way. And so hopefully we clarified some questions you had around NEAS and NC-FAS and what that will look like. And then also using the checklist that's provided and some of those resources that were provided, a few of you pointed that information out as something that you could go ahead and do in response to what you learned. And so I think that could be one really helpful resource as well. And again, that follow-up document with questions will be coming out, will be sent via email to everyone that is registered for this webinar, and we'll have all the questions, even the ones that we answered. It will have all the questions on there with answers to them and some specifics. Sometimes it may be hard to tell from a question if it's around a sending state or a receiving state. So we want to make sure that we can get all the information pulled together for you so that we can have good information. As you'll see, we have Althea and Rebekah's contact information on the screen. So if you need to contact them, you see their email there. And then also in the handouts, there was information about contacting those people that are assigned for your area.